All right, here it is. All 77 books I read in 2025. I'm Veronica, and this is the Reading Chronicles. First up is El Paciente by Juan Gomez Jurado. This was published in English under two titles, Point of Balance and The Tipping Point, and it was translated from the Spanish by Martin Michael Roberts, although I read the book in Spanish. So in this book, a top neurosurgeon has to choose between killing the President of the United States and saving the life of his kidnapped daughter. It's a standard thriller with some annoying tropes about men and women and the fact that they can never be friends that is unlikely to spark my desire to read any other book in this series. The Bee Sting by Paul Murray. This Booker Prize shortlisted multi-generational family saga following the Barnes family and the way a single event has driven the course of their entire lives was straight up my alley. This is a fantastic, messy tale told from multiple perspectives that ends abruptly and is exactly the sort of interwoven story that I love. Permafrost by Eva Baltasar. Translated from the Catalan by Nicole Damanville Alegria and translated into English by Julia Sanchez. This follows an unnamed lesbian narrator through a quarter-life crisis during which she struggles to find a job and deal with the toxically positive people in her family. I found it relatable in many ways, especially her inability to find any sort of work that coincides with her degree and her trepidation about the idea of ever having children. Boulder by Eva Baltasar. Also translated from the Catalan by Nicole Dalmanville Alegria and translated into English by Julia Sanchez. This is the second book in the Triptych series, and it also features an unnamed lesbian narrator, but this one is a bit older, and she finds herself in relationships that she never expected to have, and dealing with the fact that her partner suddenly wants a child. Continuing with the themes of permafrost, I found the narrator's sentiments about having children to be highly relatable, and I do not know what I would have done if I had found myself in her situation. Piranesi by Susanna Clarke. This book was the winner of the Women's Prize for Fiction in 2021, and it follows a man called Piranesi stuck in a labyrinth, cataloging all of the weird things it contains and working to figure out who, besides himself and the other, are walking these mysterious halls. Now, I'm not usually a reader of fantasy, and I do wish this book had been a little bit more rooted in reality in the end, but even I was drawn into the story, and I can understand the hype. A Pale View of Hills by Kazuo Ishiguro. With her younger daughter visiting for the event of her elder daughter's funeral, Etsuko remembers her past in Nagasaki and the friendship she developed with a woman there and her troubled daughter, with this desire to escape Japan's cultural norms and move to America. The story is quiet and subtle and explores reflections on the past and the questions about whether the choices one has made were the right ones and how those choices affected the people in one's life. Mammut or Mammoth by Eva Baltasar, translated from the Catalan by Nicole Damanville Alegria and into English by Julia Sanchez. This is the third in the Triptych series, and Baltasar's unnamed lesbian narrator is vastly different from her previous two in that she desperately wants to have a child, and she is not running away from motherhood. For me, this was the least relatable of the three books, not just because of the narrator's differing desires, but because of the actions she ultimately takes in those regards. Ain't Burned All the Bright by Jason Reynolds and Jason Griffin. This is a poem told in 3 long sentences written by Reynolds and illustrated by Griffin in Moleskines, and it focuses on a boy and a single day in the pandemic in which he sits with his family, his father isolated in a room, and his mother glued to the protests on TV. This is a haunting look at that devastating time through the eyes of a boy both too young to understand everything that's happening and yet too old to be able to ignore it. Call Us What We Carry by Amanda Gorman. This collection features the poem that Gorman became famous for, that she read during Biden's inauguration, as well as many others focusing on the events of the pandemic and the Black Lives Matter movement. While not quite as vibrant as the work of Reynolds and Griffin, this is a worthy collection that illustrates many of the hypocrisies in American society that we continue to deal with today. Mickey 7 by Edward Ashton. This book is the basis of Bong Joon-ho's movie Mickey 17, and the story focuses on the expendable Mickey, whose job is to go on a space mission and be a guinea pig for all sorts of dangerous tests and life-threatening repairs, as his body can be regenerated and loaded with his previous form's consciousness. It's a decent read with some fun quips, and it was a surprisingly better read than the boring movie that was made out of it. All the Water in the World by Iron Caffel. The glaciers have melted, New York is underwater, and Noni, her father, her sister, and their friend must leave their sanctuary at the American Museum of Natural History to find a new home at her aunt's farm in the Berkshires. With looks at the before times, commentary on dangers based on race and gender, and other nods at diverse characters, the story isn't the most enthralling post-apocalyptic literature out there, but it was an okay read. Homeseeking by Carissa Chen. This is a story chronicling the love of Suchi and Haiwen as they are torn apart by the circumstances of war in the first half of the 20th century in their native land of China. I love the decision to tell this story in two directions, following Suchi from the time they are children and moving into the future, and following Haiwen, now Howard, from the time that they meet again in 2008 and moving backward into the past. And this intersection of history and personal lives made this a very affecting read. Into the Uncut Grass by Trevor Noah and Sabina Hahn, narrated by Trevor Noah. This is a children's book with 3 distinct lessons. Everyone is an obstacle unless you try to understand them. Everyone thinks they're right until they discover they're wrong, and it's better to compromise together than fight and get what one wants alone. While the lessons may seem obvious to an adult, Noah reminds the reader that imagination is crucial for conflict resolution, and all one has to do is look around at the general state of the world to know this is true. Cadáver Exquisito, also known as Tender is the Flesh, by Agustina Basterrica, translated from the Spanish by Sarah Moses. In a dystopian world, animal meat has become infected with a virus that renders it deadly to humans, and the solution is to grow humans for consumption. Touching on the themes of animal cruelty and the fact that barbarities can be so easily normalized, the book didn't quite work for me due to its outrageous premise because people can survive on a vegan diet, and also due to the ultimate actions of the protagonist Marcos, a worker in a human meat slaughterhouse who is no less horrifying than the people who he criticizes for choosing to eat human meat. Las Viudas de los Jueves, or Thursday Night Widows by Claudia Piñero, translated from the Spanish by Miranda France. This book is about a group of men in a gated community who regularly meet on Thursday nights to play cards until one of the men is found drowned in his pool. Of the 4 men in the group, only Ronnie Guevara comes home that night. What starts out like a thriller turns into an examination of the families who once lived lives of luxury in the 90s, coming to their eventual downfall in the 2000s. An interesting endeavor, although the narrative shifts were a bit confusing for me. The Silent Patient by Alex Michaelides. After killing her husband, Alicia Berenson is put in a psychiatric facility and stops talking, but recently hired psychotherapist Theo Farber is convinced he's the one who can get her to start talking again. I tried this book because of all of the hype, and while it was an easy and fast read, there is only the tiniest modicum of reality in the things that happen, and the whole plot requires a heavy suspension of disbelief from the reader, which isn't really my thing. Ring Shout by P. Djeli Clark. This is a fantastical take on the KKK, following a crew who fight evil creatures known as the Ku Kluxes, who growl like dogs, stand 9 feet tall, and have their pointy heads covered with white hoods when they assume a human form. The story does a worthwhile job of exposing hate as the real villain, basing what seem like otherworldly events on things that really did happen in the US's long history of racial-based violence. We Do Not Part by Han Kang, translated from the Korean by Yao Wen and Paige Anaya Morris. Responding to a request from an artist friend to tend to her bird while she's in the hospital, Kyung-ha learns much more about her friend's work interviewing survivors of the horrific violence that swept across the island in the 1940s and 50s. Similar to Kang's own experience while writing Human Acts, the book serves as both a reminder of the terrible history that passed in Korea and an introduction to it for readers such as Westerners like me who are woefully ignorant of it. The Light We Carry, Overcoming in Uncertain Times by Michelle Obama. Narrated by Michelle Obama. A cross between a memoir and a self-help guide, Obama's follow-up to The Amazing Becoming offers advice on, among other things, how to deal with frustrations and fears, starting with kindness, the importance of being seen, and keeping one's life filled with friends and showing all of oneself. I love Obama's writing, and her ability to weave what seem like separate ideas into a cohesive narrative is on full display here. An Artist of the Floating World by Kazuo Ishiguro. Continuing on the themes of reflecting on the past and questioning if one has made the best choices, Ishiguro's second novel follows retired artist Masuji Ono as his daughter works to get married. As the potential husband's family may investigate his past, Ono has to come to terms with what his art represented, how his choices led to his present life, and how or why the younger generation in Japan may believe men like him must atone for their actions. The Warmth of Other Suns, the epic story of America's Great Migration by Isabel Wilkerson. This is a book of history following the migration of Black Americans from North to South from the years of 1915 to 1970, told through 3 narratives. Those of Ida Mae Brandon Gladney, who migrated from Chickasaw County, Mississippi to Chicago, George Swanson Starling, who migrated from Wildwood, Florida to New York, and Robert Joseph Pershing Foster, who found his way from Monroe, Louisiana to Los Angeles, California. It was an extremely compelling read that lets the research show an effort to reveal the biases and discriminations that continue to this very day. Bradbury Stories, 100 of His Most Celebrated Tales by Ray Bradbury. I finally read this almost 900-page collection of short stories by my favorite author. While I didn't love every single one, many of them stood out. Among them, And the Rock Cried Out, about a white couple stuck in Mexico during a time when the white race is being overthrown. The Garbage Collector, about a garbage man who loves his job until he receives the news that garbage men will be required to pick up bodies after the fall of the atom bomb. The Pedestrian, a precursor to Fahrenheit 451, in which a man is stopped by the police and taken to a psychiatric facility simply for walking. And The Swan, my favorite story in Dandelion Wine, about a misaligned love that time just didn't get right. Death of the Author by Nnedi Okorafor. This novel within a novel follows Zelu Onyenezi Onyedeli, a paraplegic Nigerian-American writer whose writing of a sci-fi novel about rusted robots in a fit of frustration after her sister's wedding catapults her to fame. While the story does well to explore ideas of what authors owe to readers, social media cancellation, and publishers' demands, the sections of the inner novel, Rusted Robots, weren't really that interesting to me, and the overall reliance on some well-worn tropes that I don't like led me to realize that Okorafor's writing just isn't for me. Symbiote by Michael Nyack. In Antarctica in 2028, during the second year of the Pacific Rim War and amidst a stalemate between China and the US, a new infectious life form is awakened in the ice, causing those exposed to it to go into a murderous rage and run out into the sub-zero cold. While the premise is 100% something that would appeal to me, the writing is more geared to an action movie with sarcastic quips, gratuitous romance, and a fascination with the male body, which I might actually enjoy in a 2-hour movie, but I need more than that in a 400-page book. Life Hacks for a Little Alien by Alice Franklin. Narrated by a linguist in the second-person perspective, the story follows a neurodivergent girl known only as Little Alien as she grows up and learns how to navigate life on Earth. With humorous asides on the idiosyncrasies of the English language, the novel is a stirring exploration of the attempt to follow unspoken social rules, the tendency of adults to dismiss the intelligence of kids, the effect of parental mental illness, and an obsession with what is supposedly an alien text that will drive the rest of Little Alien's life. The Death of Vivek Oji by Akwaeke Emezi. Vivek Oji dies on the first page, and the rest of the novel is an attempt to unravel what happened on that day, who Vivek really was, and how his lifeless body was delivered to his parents' door. Emezi's works frequently explore the themes of gender and cultural expectations, and this one is no different, with a secret that I did not see coming and that left me reeling for Vivek in a way that I did not expect from the story's opening pages. Disclaimer by Renee Knight. A mysterious book arrives at Catherine Ravencroft's home, and she's shocked to find that it chronicles an event that happened 20 years in the past, with the only person who could have known about it having already died. Who sent her the novel and why are central questions, and ones that sort of started to bore me, but the story goes much deeper to interrogate how we frame women's tellings of their own events in their lives, and whether we ever really allow them to speak what they know to be true. An Elderly Lady is Up to No Good by Helene Tursten, translated from the Swedish by Malin Delargy. 88-year-old Maud just wants some peace and quiet and will do anything to achieve it, even dispatching a nosy neighbor who implies that she'd like to take over Maud's place. Maud takes full advantage of the invisibility of being an older woman, and her murderous exploits are at the center of this collection of stories. I easily, perhaps troublingly so, identified with her desire to be free from all idle chatter and problems. An Elderly Lady Must Not Be Crossed, also by Helene Tursten and translated from the Swedish by Marlene Delargy. We return to Maud as she goes on a luxurious vacation in South Africa, learning more about her backstory, including her oppressive relationship with her sister, whose death she may or may not have had a hand in. While perhaps not as enchanting as the first collection of stories, Maud's extreme introversion remains in full view, making her a protagonist I can wholeheartedly identify with, except for the murder part. Come Tierra, or Earth Eater, by Dolores Reyes, translated from the Spanish by Julia Sanchez. A young girl begins to eat dirt after her mother is buried, and she begins receiving visions of what killed her, visions that continue as she grows up and that she uses to help find missing women. With some gratuitous sex scenes and a rapidly moving plot whose culmination I didn't fully understand, the story presents some thought-provoking ideas about violence against women in Argentina, but was ultimately less developed than I would have liked. The Odyssey by Homer, translated from the Greek by Robert Fagles and narrated by Sir Ian McKellen. What can I say about this classic poem about Odysseus' return from the Trojan War after being stranded by the god Poseidon? I reread this in early preparation for Christopher Nolan's upcoming film, and it's just as filled with adventure and wit as I remembered it being. Convenience Store Woman by Sayaka Murata, translated from the Japanese by Ginny Tapley Takamori. 36-year-old Keiko has been working in the same convenience store since she was 18 and has had to wear a mask of normality while her family and acquaintances pressure her to do things that she doesn't want to do, like making something more of her life, getting married and having children. This book was a great look at societal pressures on women, and it seemed to me an apt representation of asexuality, aromanticism, and neurodivergence. Paradise by Fernanda Melchor, translated from the Spanish by Sophie Hughes. Two teenagers get up to a whole lot of trouble in the gated community of Paradise, where one is obsessed with a new resident who is both married and a mother, and the other is desperate to leave his home where he lives with his abusive mother and pregnant cousin. While the middle portion of the book dragged a bit, the end employs a quick pace with pages-long sentences that rush the reader to a disturbing end rife with unfounded confidence and masculine violence. Lost Ark Dreaming by Suyi Davies Okunboa. Nominated for a Nebula Award, this speculative fiction novella focuses on those who survived the rise of the Atlantic Ocean along the west coast of Africa, an event that has left them living in partially submerged high-rise buildings where the social hierarchies of the pre-disaster world replicate themselves inside. Now, while the story does well to address the ideas of climate change, it suffers from being a bit too short to fully flesh out the idea of the children, these mythical creatures who seem to threaten this world. The Running Man by Stephen King as Richard Bachman. Set in a dystopian future in which people desperate for basic necessities compete on reality shows to earn what they need to survive. And this follows Ben Richards, the latest contestant on The Running Man, a show whose purpose is to get the entire country to hunt a player for 30 days with the hope of survival bringing with it the prize of $1 billion. I read this to prepare for the movie with Glenn Powell, and I'll just say I wish I had only watched the movie. The Housemaid by Frida McFadden. Eager to get a job after having been released from prison, Millie becomes the live-in maid to Nina and her charming husband Andrew, only for Nina's behavior to quickly become bizarre. And the super hot gardener who only speaks Italian seems to be trying to warn Millie about something. This was not the most original of plots, and it was easy to figure out what was really happening, but I can't say I didn't enjoy reading it. The Remains of the Day by Kazuo Ishiguro. Reminiscing on his life serving Lord Darlington in the 1930s, English butler Stevens reflects on what it means to have dignity and whether he, in his career and his personal life, could be said to have possessed it. This is a thoroughly engrossing novel that continues the themes of Ishiguro's previous two works, focusing on whether one has made the right choices in life. Vanishing World by Sayaka Murata, translated from the Japanese by Ginny Tapley Takamori. This story focuses on a future version of the world in which sex between married couples has become taboo, all children are born through artificial insemination, and a new experimental city has opened where all adults are mothers, and research is being conducted to allow men to birth children. What seemed like it was going to be an interesting sci-fi take dismantling current ideas about family ended up being too focused on protagonist Amane's obsession with sex and ended with a scene that, well, gave me the ick. Orbital by Samantha Harvey. This Booker Prize winning novel is just the kind of story I like. One in which nothing really happens, but the writing is beautiful. 6 astronauts orbit the Earth 16 times over the course of the short novel, giving insight into how they make sense of the day, deal with grief of losing loved ones while so far away, witness a building storm that they all know will be catastrophic, and question the progress of human civilization. Shelter by Jung Yoon. Kyung Cho is dealing with the financial burdens of raising a young family when his parents become the victims of a violent attack that rocks the exclusive upper-class neighborhood they live in. While the story fantastically looks deeply into Kyung's relationship with his parents and shows that not everything is as it seems and that people distance themselves from their parents for a reason, the sensationalistic ending ultimately made this more into a spectacle and less the profound examination of how families continue to hurt each other throughout life that I wish it had been. Feeding Ghosts by Tessa Hulse. A Pulitzer Prize-winning graphic memoir tracing 3 generations of women, the author, her mother, and her grandmother, and the lasting effects of the Chinese Civil War and communism on the way they experience reality and their relationships with each other. Replete with historical information and questions of how we can ever really know if someone's version of events is true, the book is a powerful look at how trauma continues to shape lives long after someone has experienced it. The Catch by Yrsa Daley Ward. A woman contacts her estranged twin sister after seeing a woman in her 30s who looks exactly like their mother would have looked if she hadn't disappeared into the Thames decades ago. Heavily steeped in family dysfunction and the mystery of whether this woman who has returned from the past is really their mother or just pulling a con, with a bit of loose time play thrown in, the novel fails to coalesce into anything resembling a coherent or satisfying story. All Fours by Miranda July. A woman leaves her husband and child behind to drive solo from California to New York, only to exit the highway 30 minutes later and strike up a non-sexual affair with a young man. While the book is ambitious in tackling the way midlife crises could appear for women, the story just didn't work for me and left me wishing I could gouge my eyes out after reading those horrific non-sex sex scenes. Such a Fun Age by Kylie Reed. When Amira is called unexpectedly to babysit and take out young Briar from her parents' home while they deal with an issue, she becomes the target of a supposedly well-meaning bystander who alerts a security guard to the Black woman walking around with a white child who says isn't her mother. While the novel does a competent job of illustrating exactly what benevolent racism looks like, an unsurprising plot and a lack of likable characters left this story ultimately flat for me. Stay True by Hua Su. This 2023 Pulitzer Prize-winning memoir was the first book for the renewed One Book, One Denver program and follows Sue's college friendship with Ken, who is senselessly murdered one night. At times dealing with Asian Americanness, counter and mainstream culture, and Sue's developing identity, I ultimately didn't connect much with it or find it had a cohesive narrative beyond Sue working out what this brutal event meant for his own life. Beautiful World, Where Are You? By Sally Rooney. Alternating between the narratives of Alice and Eileen, childhood friends whose lives have grown apart in adulthood, the novel examines the broader themes of love and sex and prestige, and if what one does with one's life has meaning. While the story doesn't really offer any answers and the end is a bit too neatly tied up, it ultimately offers a very realistic portrait of these relationships, both romantic and platonic, and how we can be hurt by the people we love withholding from us, while we simultaneously withhold from them. The Names by Florence Knapp. Faced with three possible decisions when registering her infant son's name, Cora's choice sets off three distinct paths for her life and the lives of her family, spanning 35 years. This was a surprisingly astute look at family and the darkness that can loom over it, and how inciting events can change the trajectory of one's life forever. Girl Sleuth, Nancy Drew and the Women Who Created Her, by Melanie Rehak. This is a biographical account of Edward Stratemeyer, who formed the writing syndicate that produced many notable children's series, including Nancy Drew, The Hardy Boys, and the Bobbsey Twins, and his daughter Harriet Adams, and writer Mildred Wirt Benson, the women who gave us the girl detective we know today. This was a somewhat disappointing read, dry in its presentation and focusing too much on the biographical details and too little on the social or literary revolution that was a series of books about a headstrong woman solving mysteries. A Separation by Katie Kitamura. A young woman must go to Greece to search for the husband who hasn't returned his mother calls. But the catch is that the woman has not yet told anyone that she and her husband have separated. In a richly interior narrative that is dotted with the mystery of a man's disappearance, the novel explores the turbulence of love and what it means when love has come to an end. The Secret of the Old Clock by Carolyn Keene. This is the first book in the Nancy Drew series, and it finds the girl detective working to solve the twin mysteries of the deceased Josiah Crowley, who has surprised the relatives with whom he was close by writing them out of his will, and of some stolen silver of one set of the Crowley's cousins. Nancy still reads as a strong, capable woman today, although heavy attention paid to how good she is may render the depiction of the 18-year-old a little flat for modern readers. The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy by Douglas Adams. A 20 years later reread about a group of humans and aliens who traverse the galaxy after Earth has been destroyed to make way for bypass. It is every bit as hilarious and engaging as I remember it to be, and it definitely merits the revisit. The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe by C.S. Lewis. This was another reread in my attempt to finally read all of the Chronicles of Narnia. Following the adventures of siblings Peter, Susan, Edmund, and Lucy through a wardrobe into the land of Narnia, their efforts to defeat the White Witch with the help of the lion Aslan, and rescue the magical place from eternal winter, this book is a classic for a reason. Nancy Drew, The Palace of Wisdom by Kelly Thompson, Jen St. Onge, Triona Farrell, and Ariana Maher. This is a graphic novel reimagining of the famed girl detective, this time brought to solve the murder of a working-class Black woman while confronting the truths of her own societal standing. This was a highly enjoyable story with wonderful images, and I can see this being much more relatable to today's young people than the supremely upstanding Nancy of 100 years ago. The Restaurant at the End of the Universe by Douglas Adams. A search for the ruler of the universe brings the gang to the restaurant at the end of the universe, where beings across the galaxy come to see the universe end. Grammar is a fickle endeavor, and the origins of modern humans are discovered. While the plot may be a bit of a MacGuffin, it serves well for Adams' sharp observations on the absurdity of humanity. Nancy Drew, Girl Detective Without a Trace by Carolyn Keene. A 21st century Nancy Drew who takes on the concurrent mysteries of a neighborhood zucchini smasher and a stolen Fabergé egg. This is a perfectly competent addition to the 1930s series, if written in a bit more simplistic style that lends a younger feeling to it. America, America, A New History of the New World by Greg Grandin. This is a grand, sweeping history of the American continent and the way the Northern, and particularly the United States, and the southern halves formed in opposition to each other. I commend Grandin for his work, but for me, this was just too much information about too many things, and I found it really hard to follow all of the historical names and threads, leaving me wanting to DNF it multiple times. Nancy Drew Diaries, Curse of the Arctic Star. A 2010s reinvention of the girl detective, this time boarding a cruise ship with her best mates to solve the mystery of threatening messages their superstar passenger has received. This is an even more watered down version of the spunky, self-sufficient young woman from the 1930s series, with simplistic writing, too much exposition, and some mature things despite a very childish looking cover. Food Intelligence, The Science of How Food Both Nourishes and Harms Us, by Julia Bellews and Kevin Hall, PhD. A journalist and a scientist band together to answer the question of why do we eat what we eat? Despite its sometimes childish narrative tone, the book is packed full of useful and important information regarding misconceptions about metabolism, macronutrients, vitamin supplements, fat loss and obesity, processed food, and the idea that the individual is solely at fault when it comes to consciously choosing the right or the wrong foods. The Story of a Heart, Two Families, One Heart, and the Medical Miracle That Saved a Child's Life, by Dr. Rachel Clark. Following the transplantation of a heart from one 9-year-old child to another, Clark masterfully weaves together numerous interviews to tell the story of Max, Kira, their families, and the gift of life. Interspersed with the history of medical breakthroughs that have made such an event possible, this moving nonfiction narrative is a must-read. Someone You Can Build a Nest In, by John Wiswell. A shapeshifter falls in love with the woman who saves her, only to find out she's the monster this woman's family has been hunting for decades. Far from a typical fantasy romance, this whip-smart story includes a boatload of representation: neurodivergence, body diversity, survival of abuse, that makes it ultimately a story about the human experience. Heartlamp, by Banu Mushtaq, translated from the Kannada by Deepa Bhashti. This International Booker Prize winning collection of 12 short stories focuses on the struggles of women in the highly patriarchal Muslim communities of India. Following girls who have had to leave school to take care of their siblings, women who have to beg their husbands for food for their shared children, and men who refuse their wives the ability to have sterilization surgeries, it is a difficult but necessary read. Where the Crawdads Sing, by Delia Owens, narrated by Cassandra Campbell. By the age of 7, Kaya has been abandoned by everyone in her family and grows up as the strange Marsh Girl. Meanwhile, more than a decade into the future, a man is found murdered, and the novel follows the convergence of Kaya's life and this violent event. With its romance, sex, and mystery, it's easy to see why this book became popular. I just wish it had also been good. The Nancy Drew Files, Secrets Can Kill, by Carolyn Keene. In this late 1980s revamp of the series, the one that I primarily read as a child, Nancy must go undercover as a high school student to solve what starts out to be an somewhat innocent case of locker break-ins and vandalism that quickly escalates to murder. This series presents a more mature version of Nancy that, while still being formulaic and containing sometimes problematic content surrounding weight, is still surprisingly easy to swallow from a 2020s perspective, proving the power and endurance of strong female characters. Life, the Universe, and Everything, by Douglas Adams. This is the third book in the 5-book trilogy, and it finds the gang tasked with stopping the people of Cricket, a planet previously surrounded by a dust cloud, from destroying everything in the universe once they realize they aren't the only ones in it. Although the plotline is a bit difficult for me to hold, I'm still enamored of Adam's writing and musing on the destructive ways of those who inhabit the universe, i.e., humans. The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes by Suzanne Collins, narrated by Santino Fontana. After initially DNFing this prequel to the Hunger Games series, focusing on how President Snow became the tyrannical dictator we know him to be, I decided to give it another try. Sadly, it did not prove to be any less boring, insipid, or unnecessary than I had originally deemed it to be. The Secret of Shadow Ranch by Carolyn Keene. Cousins Bess Marvin and George Fane are introduced in the 5th installment in the original Girl Detective series. While the mystery remains readable and the series can be commended for presenting all of its female characters as highly capable, some unnecessary comment on weight and use of offensive terminology for Indigenous women warrant notice by modern readers. The Safe Keep by Yael van der Wooden. Isolated and living in the country house that her family moved into after leaving Amsterdam during World War II, Isabel will find her world upended by the arrival of Eva, her brother's girlfriend who moves into the house while he's away for work. As Eva's loud personality grates on Isabel and as things start disappearing within the house, Isabel will have to come to terms with who she is, the truth of her family, their place in history, all of this making this novel incredibly compelling. So Long and Thanks for All the Fish by Douglas Adams. In this 4th book in the series, we follow Arthur Dent back on an Earth that was not destroyed by the Vogons to build a hyperspace bypass, and his connection with Fenchurch, the girl who had a sudden epiphany about how to make the world a good and happy place just before it was blown up in the 1st book of the series. Centering on their romance, this story proves to be less crucial to the overall series than the previous 3 books. Mostly Harmless by Douglas Adams. In the final book in the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy trilogy, we meet up with an alternate version of Trillian, known here as Tricia McMillan, living on Earth and trying to make it as a TV news reporter when she gets visited by aliens. The story of our intergalactic band of travelers is brought to a dark close, retaining only a fraction of the joy the series starts out with. The Thursday Murder Club by Richard Osman. 4 residents of the Cooper's Chase retirement community gather every Thursday to put their talents to work and solve cold cases until one day a present-day murder practically lands on their doorstep. The book is full of hard characters with rich backstories and an endearing respect for the capabilities of the older generation, making it a surprisingly engrossing read. Flesh by David Soloy. Following the emotionally underdeveloped Ishvan from teenage years to middle-aged adulthood, the novel quietly charts the way that events can direct a life, especially one in which few conscious decisions have been made. Despite not loving the story while I was reading it and feeling wholly detached from its protagonist, it's one that I continued to think about long after finishing it, leading to an overall change in my view of what the novel was trying to convey. Satan Tango by Laszlo Krasznahorkai, translated from the Hungarian by George Zirtes. A man who is thought to have been dead for 18 months mysteriously reappears in a decaying town, forcing the morally decrepit residents to question their part in a local tragedy. Winner of the Nobel Prize though he may be, I found Krasznahorkai's writing to be largely obscure and difficult to understand, and not something that I'm eager to return to. The Teacher of Nomadland, a World War II story, by Daniel Nayeri. Winner of the National Book Award for Young People's Literature, this story follows siblings Bobak and Sana after their father, a teacher, is mistaken for a resistance fighter by British and Soviet troops and is killed. While the story does offer valuable insight into the impact of World War II on Iran and the importance of language, the simplistic writing and predictable plot left me wanting more. Frankenstein or The Modern Prometheus by Mary Shelley. This was I think, fourth time reread for me, one that I took upon just to make sure that my judgment of the movie, that promised to be the most faithful screen adaptation of this book, was not, in fact, faithful to the book. Although this wasn't a loss, because the book was even more brilliant and beautiful than I remember it being. The Tainted Cup by Robert Jackson Bennett. Described as a Holmes and Watson style mystery, this fantasy mystery novel pairs together a detective who blindfolds herself to limit outside stimulation and her assistant whose enhanced memory allows him to recall everything he's seen and heard in the effort to solve a murder. For those who enjoy fantasy and things described as Holmes and Watson but are not actually Holmes and Watson, this might be a winner. But for me, it was a dud. Prince Caspian by C.S. Lewis. The four Pevensey siblings find themselves pulled back to Narnia, where they learn of young Caspian X, rightful ruler of Narnia, but whose father was usurped by his brother, Caspian's uncle, and who now rules the world unjustly. It's up to the Pevenseys, a cast of old Narnians, Aslan, and Caspian himself, to set Narnia to rights in this tale that is just as enchanting as the one that first introduced us to Peter, Susan, Edmund, and Lucy. And my last read of the year, The Voyage of the Dawn Treader by C.S. Lewis. With the Pevensey parents and Susan in America and Peter studying for exams, Edmund and Lucy are doomed to spend their summer with their horrid cousin Eustace, only for the three to be drawn into the fantasy for one more adventure with Prince Caspian aboard the Dawn Treader. Traveling to lands beyond Narnia this time, they search for the 7 friends of the usurped King Caspian, offering less of a straight plot and more of a series of stories that is still very enjoyable to read. And there are all 77 of the books I read in 2025. Which were some of your most favorite reads of the year? Let me know in the comments. See you in the next video.